Welcome to the Dairy News and Views podcast, a production of the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Dairy Team. Our podcast covers current educational, research, and industry tools available for your operation to manage healthy cows and calves while producing the highest quality dairy products. Thanks for joining us today on Dairy News and Views from the ISU Dairy Team. I'm Jen Bentley, Northeast Iowa Dairy Field Specialist, and I'm here with my colleagues, Larry Tranel, Northeast and Southeast Dairy Field Specialist, and Brian Doherty, our Northeast Iowa Field Ag Engineer, as we recap the forage field day from earlier this week called Grass to Glass, Soil and Nutrition Systems for Organic Dairies. So welcome back to the podcast, Larry and Brian.
Appreciate that. Thanks, Jen.
Thanks for having us.
So this week we had a really great learning opportunity out at Scott Wiedemeyer's organic dairy farm near Maynard, Iowa. Larry, I know, and Brian, we've all worked with this farm on multiple pasture walks and parlor renovations over the last few years. And so it was great to get back out there and see the advancements that he's done on his farm in making dairy cow health and soil health a priority. So Larry and Brian, as we listen to Scott's journey of the improvements he's made and the challenges along the way, you both delivered some information as we walked and viewed the grazing paddocks. So what were some takeaway messages you'd like to share with our podcast audience?
Yeah, so we had a session focused around soil health, and I guess I kind of have three takeaways from that. The first one would be that, when we're looking at pasture productivity or forage productivity, soil health is really a critical component of that. So if we want to have good biomass production and healthy livestock, soil health is one way to kind of help get us there, I guess, is the way I would explain it. So one of the things we looked at was how well aggregated is the soil, and that's critical for getting your water to infiltrate, getting good air exchange, in and out of the soil to really help make that system work. And we did an infiltration test there at Wiedemeyer's, and he had extremely high infiltration rates out in his pastures. So if you get a heavy rainfall, there's going to be minimal to no runoff. And that's really what we want to see to keep that soil armored and minimize erosion. Then I guess the third takeaway is we hear a lot about soil health now, and there's a lot of interest in carbon sequestration and markets around that. And as we saw at Wiedemeyer's there, well-managed rotational grazing is hands down the fastest way to help rebuild your soil and restore soil organic matter levels back to where they maybe were previously, before we started farming these areas. So just incredible soil there at Wiedemeyer's. It's some of the healthiest soil I've ever seen. Excellent aggregation. Hopefully the people that were there were able to kind of witness that. We did some different tests. We did what's called a slump test, where you wet the soil down and you see, how well those aggregates hold together. So that's another important component, because if they fall apart very easily, you're going to tend to have more erosion if you get a heavy rainfall event. So excellent field day overall.
Yeah, I guess some of the takeaways I would have is just, first of all, like with Brian's soil health workshop, I was overly impressed with just how, like you just saying, just the quality of that soil. And so I think some of the bigger takeaways I had from it was not just the that quality of soil, but I had the privilege of being on that farm close to 22 years ago, doing a pasture walk. And I just remember early on with some of the weeds, and you take a look at sward density. And so one of the bigger takeaways I would have is just how do you produce quality and quantity of pasture? And so sward density is something that pretty much has grown over the last 20 years, where 20 years ago you could see a lot of bare spots all over that pasture. I actually had to look to try to find some bare spots in that pasture so if I'm looking from a bird's eye view, just going straight down, it was very difficult to actually see bare dirt. And so that to me is just a great sign of some good pasture. And in addition, he had a real good, I guess the second takeaway would be just the amount of clover he had in comparison to the grass. And so he was probably in certain parts of the pastures 35 to 40% clover, but there's various parts that was probably over 50% clover. When you take a look at that, just forages tend to grow better together. So your grasses and your legumes tend to do better. You tend to get better yields. Legumes kind of fix the some nitrogen for the grasses. So it's just a kind of nice little work in progress, I think, just trying to get both quality and quantity of pastures out there, because one of the biggest limitations, as most people know, for dairy cows on pasture is that they can only take so many bites per day. So a pasture dairy cow will take about 27,000 bites a day versus a cow in confinement only about 11,000. And so she's when she takes a bite, she's got to get a darn big bite to get this to work out, and for her to get enough dry matter intake to actually, be able to produce the milk that she wants. And so I'm just kind of thinking, the big takeaways were undoubtedly just the quantity and the quality of that pasture and how it's grown, in density over the years. And so like when I was walking out there, it kind of reminded me of walking on some pastures in Ireland where you actually kind of have this a little sod underneath you. It feels like you're walking on a carpet. It wasn't quite that, but it was definitely approaching that. So I can only imagine what another 5 or 10 years is going to bring to that pasture.
Yeah, so some great takeaways there and great learning opportunity for those that were able to attend. However, we were able to capture some audio out in the field that day. And so now we're going to tune into that piece of the conversation as it relates to the pasture management and soil health. And so I encourage our listeners also to stay tuned to our Dairy Team YouTube channel as we'll feature some of the highlight videos from that field day. And we look forward to visiting with you on the next Dairy News and Views from ISU.
So the next thing I want to kind of move into is just when you take a look at grazing as a system, and just as you're looking at buying a new farm, do you want to graze, do you not want to graze, go organic and things like that. And so when you take a look at what we have here is just one of the big things about grazing, I tend to say is that we want to make sure that we graze it quickly, and Scott's alluded to that several different times already. So once you're in there, so the cows, and I used to graze heifers as well, and sometimes I'd be moving them even 3 times a day. Just because I could see the benefits on the pasture just from really fast grazing. And so when you take a look at the milk cows, at least every 12 hours, get them on a new pasture or a new piece of it. And I really appreciate what Scott says. That sometimes when you're in these long, narrow pastures and they're in them more than 3 days, okay, that will start regrowing. And basically what's happening is you're just going to start eating that regrowth, and it will kind of cost you both in milk production, because that regrowth, it takes a lot of bites to try to get even a little bit, but that's what they want to go back after. So that's kind of shooting yourself in the foot a couple different ways with it. But the couple rules with grazing is that we want to make sure we try to keep this in a vegetative state. So it takes quite a bit of time for that pasture to actually grow that first 3 to 4 inches. And once it's beyond where that growing point gets into that 4 inches, from there till about 12 to 14, even 16 inches. And so I like to take my black boots, which are usually about 14 inches tall, and that's how I gauge my pasture height, what they are, is with my black boots. So when you get in there at 14 to 16 inches, okay, that's its growth phase. And then after that 14 to 16 inches, it starts thinking about reproducing, creating the seed head, and that's what you don't want to have happen unless you want to let some pastures go to kind of reseed it for the future. So that's your fast growth stage. Okay, once it starts seeding, it kind of slows down, and all that energy goes into that seed head. So you want to keep it in the vegetative stage while you're grazing. And so the second thing is when you take it off, for milk cows, we tend to say you take about half of it. So if you get it down to about 6 or 8 inches, that's probably about as far as you want to go with a milk cow, because then you're going to be sacrificing production if you take it down any much further to that. Okay, so then after, if you take it down too low, again, that regrowth is going to be a big part of it. And then the third rule is always just make sure we're resting after grazing. So in the springtime, that rest phase might only be 12 to 15 days. By the time you get into mid-August, and we actually had a pretty good growing year this year, so we didn't probably rest our pastures. Tell that by how much we cut our lawns. That's always a pretty good gauge, because I was still cutting my lawn, I think, weekly, even through August or whatever. And so that rest is definitely important. And so when people take a look at getting cows to milk off pasture, there's a high level of management that it tends to take. Okay, and I just, again, kind of my visions of being here in 2003 and 2004, what this looked like compared to what it looks like today. Like I said, I am very impressed with what the soil looks like, what your sward density looks like. And so the second thing I tend to take a look at when we're trying to graze cows is that one of the bigger things is just you got to compare it to cows in confinement. So a cow in confinement, in about 3.5 hours and about 11,000 bites, that cow can actually take all her dry matter intake needs in that time period. So a cow out on pasture, when we take a look at them, you'll very seldom, you'll very seldom see a fat cow out on pasture. Okay, their rumen fill doesn't fill up quite as much. You get faster passage going through the rumen, and just a few things like that. And actually, if they have too much protein, it actually has to go through the kidneys, and it actually takes more energy for the cow to actually expend, to actually get rid of that extra urea and things like that. And so you really want to kind of make sure you're balancing a few of those things with it. Quantity of pasture and the quality. And so if a cow, it's only got that 4-inch cutter bar, and so if it can't intake enough forage, it's going to be losing something onto it. So that's why you have to start, when you take a look at feed supplements and things like that, if they can't get it out on pasture, we're either going to sacrifice production, or we got to start feeding some supplements with it as well. So in the springtime, cows, even high producing cows, they'll actually decrease their grain intake if they're on some very succulent type pastures just because they like it so well. And it's always kind of weird sometimes when the cows would come in the barn and you see their grain and they won't even clean up their grain just because they like the pasture so well. The other thing coming into the pasture here is that I think like up there, I mean, there's probably at least 50% legume in that stand right here. If we get back down to here, you're probably in that 25 to 30%. So you might actually be a little short of legume percentage in here. And again, just anytime you add things like, so we have straight alfalfa fields, and you've got, which is kind of a monoculture. And anytime you put another grass or something into that monoculture, you can actually increase its yields by about 15 to 20%. Okay, so legumes and grasses actually grow better together. One of my favorite ones is actually a combination of Kura clover and reed canary grass. And here we have a lot of Kura clover and orchard grass, which research will show won't be that much different than what the sward that I tend to work with. So when you take a look at that sward, so Kura clover is one. Since he's got so much Kura clover in here, I'm going to talk about that. About 3/4 of the yield is alfalfa, okay, but it's actually a richer plant. It's got more energy, and it's very dense. When people talk about Kura clover, it actually came from Eastern Europe. And I was actually over there one time, and I talked to them a little bit about this plant. I said, well, why don't we see you guys grazing that? We're grazing it over here. Why don't you guys have it? And they said, well, I think that's the one that killed all our cows. Okay, so it's very bloaty. But the reason it's bloaty, it's not any more bloaty per pound of dry matter material, but it is bloaty because you get such stands in there that just can fill out. And like I said, sometimes this root on a single plant can actually be 20 pounds. Okay, so just from that single root, and it can get so dense, and because they can take so much of it in such a short period of time, that's why it tends to be bloaty and why they tend to say it would kill some of their cows. The other thing I would tend to say with Kura clover is that you're not going to be able to kill it out. Okay, you can chemically exterminate this. Next year it's probably going to start coming back again. It's going to come back again. It's going to be tough to kill it. So if you're going to put it on your farm, you better want to keep it there. And I've got quite a bit of it on my farm as well, and I really just enjoy it. It's probably my favorite grazing crop to work with, or at least the legume part of it. But it's just something that I think if people want to buy it, it's tough to buy in the market. I tried to buy some because might even try to grow some seed on it. But it's about $12 a pound to actually try to buy this stuff. And I couldn't even get it for $12 a pound, but I did call the University of Minnesota, and I actually got a little bit of an end being an extension person, so I did get about 50 pounds of it to actually plant about 10 acres. And the other thing is that you don't need that much, and so even if you only put 1 or 2 pounds per acre on here, the whole concept is how does a pasture grow over a concept or a time period of about 20 years? And just to look what this thing did, what it looked like 20 years ago compared to what it looks like now, is that if you're going to graze, you got to have high management, and it's got to be persistent. Okay, and you're going to let the things develop over time. And so if you don't have much patience, what a lot of people don't because they want their crop this year, Kura clover, like reed canary grass, it'll sleep the first year. And every time I planted, I go out there that first year and said, I got another failure. It's not going to come up for me. So I planted some about 2 years ago. I went out there this fall, and sure enough, it's like gangbusters out there. And I'm going to go out there next spring and even next fall. I'm going to sit there, holy cow, what am I going to do with all this stuff? Because it sleeps, it creeps, and then it leaps. Okay, so you got to have some patience in putting both the reed canary grass and the Kura clover into it. The other thing about plant species is that when I set up a system for grazing, people always talk about orchard grass, they talk about brome grass, they talk about red clover, is that I don't want to talk about species. I want to talk about the variety within the species because that's what you want to go. So I don't know what variety of orchard grass this is, but to me it looks like it's one that's pretty darn palatable because the cows are eating it. So if you get some orchard grass, don't just buy orchard grass. They have a palatability index on orchard grass from 1 to 5, with 5 being the best palatability. And you will find some orchard grasses out there with palatability ratings of about 1, 1.2. And you will also find some with about 4, 4.5. Which one do you want? Do you want the higher one? Okay, because that's what the cows are going to eat. There's also rust-resistant type varieties and other types of things in there. So if you ever go to a seed store and you see on this seed variety not stated, don't buy it. Okay, there's probably a reason why the variety is not stated on that thing. Okay, so the other thing about pasture is that you're going to utilize, so like if you ensile this pasture, you're going to actually, there's some water-soluble carbohydrates you're going to lose in the ensiling process. So that's the nice thing about fresh forage. Cows are also going to have better endocrine tone, so you're going to get, reproductive management, things like that, as long as the energy isn't limiting. So what's the biggest limiting factor of rations for cows on pasture? Energy, no doubt. So when people talk about protein being a limiting factor, sometimes that protein being too much might be a limiting factor, but it tends to be the energy. It's energy, energy, energy. And so I don't even phase, and I know you've got some management type things with the energy, so if you want to refute anything I say, feel free to do that as well. But we then definitely take a look is that I don't worry about protein on the pastures too much until that energy load's actually taken care of. And again, the realization that too much protein is actually going to be a hindrance to the cows as well.
You can actually have enough energy in your ration, but you have too much protein, and it still has a negative energy balance to the cow. And a lot of people don't realize that.
Big point.
Early on, that's something that I struggled with early on. On paper, on the computer, it said, yeah, you have plenty of energy, but we were still losing weight. We still weren't getting our cows bred, and it actually had to do with just too much protein. That's why I started looking really strongly at our mun levels and monitoring the cows, what their milk tastes like. It all came together then once we figured that out.
So again, the process is that if you got too much protein, it's got to go through those kidneys, and that urea, it's got to excrete that urea, and it actually takes energy out of the cows to do it. So, yeah, too much protein can undoubtedly work with that. And I've got a little handout for you up there that's actually going to take a concept of it. So when we take a look at the energy levels, and so what do we do if we're short on energy? One of the things about if you feed grain to your cows, and you think these cows are getting so much pasture intake, but they're not getting that pasture intake and you're still feeding that grain, what are you going to end up with? Subacute rumen acidosis. Okay, so we got to make sure we kind of have a pretty good feel what these cows are eating, and nutritionists around, you can kind of chime in here wherever you want as well. So starch utilization, again with that, as the cows are eating the grains and things, the finer you can do, because the passage through these rumens on pasture is so fine. We want to make sure that starch utilization is well utilized if you are feeding some grains. So the finer it is, the better utilization we're going to take a look at. We do have some farms in Iowa that don't feed any grain to their cows. Okay, how do they get by with that? Okay, they are sacrificing milk production. Some are getting that extra $4 or $5 a hundredweight from wherever they're selling the milk to actually pay for it. And I tend to say that's about what it takes, is about $4 or $5 extra dollars per hundredweight to actually compensate for that lost milk production. But we do have some that are getting, say, about 12,000 pounds of milk. We have some that are only getting about 8,000 or 9,000 pounds of milk. I've got a couple that I know that are probably only getting 6,000 and 7,000 pounds of milk. Okay, if you're really low production like that, that grass milk might not be panning out. But if you can get between that 9,000 and 12,000, especially on a Holstein herd, if you're getting 12,000 pounds of milk without feeding any grain, I would tend to think you're doing pretty good. And most of the financial analysis that we're running would actually say they are doing quite well with it as well. So when we take a look at, again, just that pasture management. So if you're going to take a look at this stuff, take a look at from a bird's eye view on this pasture. I mean, do you see any bare ground whatsoever? Okay, there's not a lot of pastures that I look at nowadays that I don't see hardly any bare ground whatsoever, unless I'm on my own farm, of course. Yeah. But even on my own farm, I'm not seeing them quite this thick in a lot of different places. So that sward density is so important, because when that cow takes a bite, she better be taking a darn big bite. Okay, and that's kind of the limitation between confinement. Again, if she's got to take 27,000 bites a day, okay, just to fill up that the dry matter that she needs, I mean, that's the important piece of it. So the sward density is definitely huge.
The other thing you're looking at from the cow standpoint is the way we're breeding cows today in the industry, or we're taking a lot of the width out of the cow. When you take the width out of the cow, you also narrow her nose up. When you narrow her nose up, you narrow her jaw up. So every time she takes a bite, she takes less of a bite than the cow with the big wide muzzle. So we're looking at cows, like this cow here, this white cow in front of us. She's got a big wide muzzle on her, that she can take more feed in than the white one right next to her, 889, the one right behind Larry. She's got a smaller mouth. She's, not a tiny mouth, but she can eat more in one bite than the other cow. And that's some of the reason why they're leaving,
So as you mentioned that, it also makes me think of like cows in New Zealand and Australia. Has anybody been to New Zealand and Australia? So what do the necks look like?
Like a giraffe neck there. Oh.
They're long necks. So it's actually quite dramatic how short the necks are on our cows versus a New Zealand cow, where they can just kind of tip their head over and just their nuzzles are already on the ground there. I did want to go through just one other thing too, just a sample ration. So I want you to talk about yours. So I'm going to do the one. So I'm actually involved in Tranel Family Farms. We're an organic dairy in Wisconsin as well, and so I kind of have a little bit of financial wherewithal in that dairy. So we have about, and I think this will be kind of a good little synopsis to take a look at. So right now they're getting about 65 to 67 pounds of milk. It's 4.0, 3.3 protein. So we feed about 20 pounds dry matter pasture. Okay, so when you take a look at the limitations, some of the research will show that you probably can get 28 to 30 pounds of dry matter into a cow if it's dense like this and you're really doing a good job properly managing. In most senses, I would tend to say most people are going somewhere between that 20 to 25. There's quite a few, I guess, that if they're not organic and don't have the requirements, are actually doing even a little bit of less than that. But we feed about 15 pounds dry matter corn silage, 4 pounds of snaplage, and anywhere between 4 to 8 pounds of ground corn. It's a pound of mineral, 2 pounds of soybean meal, and then the remainder is just kind of either some dry hay or straw, just whatever we need to try to mix that ration into it. So I think they've got a herd average, about 24,000 pound rolling herd average with it. And I think on the handout that I'm going to give you, just a little bit of a table about the price of corn versus the price of milk and where your break-evens kind of might be on some of these. So anytime you're feeding additional grain to the cow, and this is where I really want Scott to come in after I'll finish my sonnet, but then you talk about the cost part of it coming into it as well. And so when you take a look at when you feed a cow grain, so when you feed a pound of grain, hopefully you're going to get about anywhere between 0.4 to maybe 2/3 of a pound of milk back, okay? So then I'm talking about cows on pasture here. Okay, so when you feed that pound of grain, in addition, you're not going to displace a pound of forage. You're probably going to displace somewhere between 0.4 to 0.6 pounds of forage from feeding that grain. So there's a couple different things going on in that relationship. And so when you take a look at what our organic corn prices are now and also what conventional corn prices are now, is that extra pound, if you can get that half a pound back, the economics seem like they work out pretty good right now. So when you take a look at where I'm at, we can grow corn silage pretty readily even with an organic. So we're usually getting 200 to 240 bushel of corn. So we're in Tama silt loam soils, which when I take a look at my soils, I didn't think anybody over here had my kind of soils, but now Scott's got some competition here, so I'm going to have to talk to him a little bit more about that. But just when you take a look at the costs going into it, your thought process, versus, feed more grain versus what you're getting out here, what are you thinking?
So since we became organic, our worst cropping experiences has been with soybeans. Not that we didn't produce crop, it just doesn't look real good in our community where everybody has no weeds in theirs, and it doesn't take much to make a crop of beans look weedy. So we have been feeding roasted beans the last several years, and this year we're going to move away from the roasted beans. We're trying to get to, well, one with the potential to get on the grass truck. We talked about that, and then the second one to get away from the management of the beans, and the third is to get away from the intensive management of a corn silage crop. We already are pretty stretched pretty thin with the other crop acres we have in the size of the farm we're at. So nitrogen is our biggest. This is kind of a long story, our long answer to a short question. We're trying to look at utilizing our nitrogen more efficiently on our farm, more of a holistic approach. Typically, we were growing corn silage. We chop it, plant rye, and then we'd figure something else out, plant, maybe went back to hay the next year. Now we're growing our corn for grain, and we're using summer cover crop to like a 13-way species mix. We're trying to get clovers and nitrogen produced on every acre of our soil every year to build our carryover nitrogen. And so we're actually moving away from the corn silage component of the ration, realizing that when you feed corn silage, it's a poorly mineralized plant. It's basically got energy, and then it's just kind of, there's not much else in it, really. There's 7% protein if you're lucky, or 8% protein if you're really lucky. So we're looking at this multi-species mix where we're going to have like radishes and turnips, sunflowers and millet and sorghum, mung beans and buckwheat. So there's 13 other species in it. I can't remember what they all are, we're looking at a more minerally diversified mix to increase the health of our livestock and also allow us to have a feed that we can utilize in different areas. We can utilize that feed as a heifer feed. We can utilize that feed as a cow feed. We just have to add more corn to it. Okay, so we can put the amount of corn in there we need to, instead of trying to stuff this feed here, stuff this feed here to make it fit. So our ration, we had been typically feeding corn silage, just kind of like Tranels had been feeding. But this year we're switching over. We're going to feed this 13-way mix in our cow ration and just supplement the corn. It's just an easier system, less labor. There's more weed competition. It's also allows us to compete with the weeds. It scavenges nitrogen, yet it's there, has a crop underneath of it to put nitrogen back in for the next year. We can rotate to another crop without having to haul a bunch of manure. That seems to be an issue on a holistic approach on an organic farm is, yeah, we can grow these large crops, but it takes a significant amount of nitrogen, whether it's chicken litter, cow manure, or any other manure, to put in there. When you bring all that in, you're also adding so much phosphorus and potassium that we're not, there's times we're not utilizing it all on a short rotation system. So we're moving away from that, trying to grow our nitrogen, trying to spread out our phosphorus and potassium use on our farm.
And I think there's quite a few other farms that are doing what they call more of this cocktail mix as well. I know we're doing that on our farm as well, and it's got about 3 or 4 different, maybe even 5 different plants in it. So I mean, it's like sorghum sudan grass, and it's got some clovers into it, turnips, and a few things like that. But I think that's getting a little bit more popular as well. So I think bottom line is there's definitely a lot of different ways to feed these cows. So I think part of the reason we're doing that is because of maybe more of the triple cropping, so we can get the ryegrass, the corn silage, and get this cocktail mix in the second year or whatever. So trying to do 3 crops in 2 years. But instead of the corn silage going out for us, it's probably more of the alfalfa that's probably leaving it just because of the winter kills and some of those things that we've been having on our farm. So
this institution is an equal opportunity provider. For the full non-discrimination statement or combination inquiries, go to www.extension.iastate.edu/diversity/ext.